Comeback Team community, welcome to the Comeback Team podcast. Here with Coach Chuck Wolf, Trevor T.A. Anderson, Robert Masson here. Today I'm going to go more into their space as the sports spine neurosurgeon of the bunch who tries to live up to the task. You know, we're going to be talking about some foundational building blocks, and they're going to go with the deep dive into those building blocks. And we're going to focus, you know, you've already initiated, you've already learned what the initiation maintenance process looked like. You've already got a structured plan of how you're going to navigate and execute this physical journey that you're on towards your goals or your compass headings. And so what are the foundational building blocks of that journey? And so we're really going to try to structure it and focus it around mobility, around flexibility, about agility, about speed and strength. And then let them break down into the semantics, the sequencing, the optimization, and ultimately how you can incorporate it into your journey as you develop yourself forward. DA, let me start with you.
Yeah, so, this is near and dear to me. Chuck, I know I've looked at the things that you've done for a long time, and one of the most fascinating things is how you prepare people to perform. And that's something I've always been fond of, and in my experience, I've always been able to look at people that I admire, and when they start saying some of the same things that I've already discovered myself or learned, I realize I'm on the right track. And therefore, I spend a lot of my time, this phrase has been messed up a lot of times, but there's this old Abraham Lincoln quote where he said, if I had 6 hours to chop down the tree, I'd spend the first 4 sharpening the axe, right? So I tend to be that kind of a guy where the MO on me and the scouting report on me is a TA, you in these warm-ups, right? You in these activation routines, you in these active dynamic preparation, exercises that you have us doing. Oftentimes what we find is that people rush right through the preparation and activation phase to get right to the nuts and bolts of whatever they think that their workout goal is. And for me, I think that there's so much value in the preparation. There's so much value in the activation that if you skip over this step, you could literally be missing a critical aspect of what can allow you to perform at your best. And so what I like to do is I like to start from the ground up, really establishing a high level of stability, right? Creating a great relationship with the ground, then transitioning that into mobility and flexibility. Mobility is of the joints, flexibility of the muscles. Flexibility is very important because, as Chuck will dig deep on shortly, but it's important because it can restrict mobility. Lack of flexibility can restrict mobility, which we need to be able to do to move around our body athletically and have a high level of performance. And then ultimately the coordination. Okay, you have the great stability, the great connection with the ground. You have the right mobility, right, and movement. But how do you bring that together in a coordinated effort that allows you to maximize movement efficiency, force generation, power generation, and then being under control while you do it? And so I spend a lot of my time, especially the first couple of weeks of what I call the acclimation phase, when my athletes are getting acclimated to new movement patterns, new exercises, new movements that they may have never seen. They're going to experience the soreness, right? The delayed onset muscle soreness, and a lot of that's going to be neuro. A lot of that's going to be because the nervous system hasn't experienced that type of stabilization or proprioception before. But I realize that phase is the thing. So that's our acclimation phase. We transition into another phase, which we call concentration, where we can up the intensity, we can up the volume, right? Because the body's prepared for that. And then ultimately that integration phase. Chuck, if you're a baseball player, I'm going to integrate exercises and movements that are going to help you be specifically ready for playing second base or playing center field or the things that you have to do. So in my world, just in a nutshell initially, movement prep and activation is a very, very big key for me. And that's how I bring out the most in my athletes. Chuck, watching you for years, that's always been a staple of what you've done. And not only that, you've taken it to the next level. What are some of the techniques that you've done that have helped you come to that conclusion as that being an important factor?
You make great points about movement prep. And today we're going to talk about golf, but it can be applied to any activity, and it isn't any just sport. If you have somebody who's out there in the community that works in a warehouse or does construction work or that has some type of physical labor to it, movement's movement. And we have to make sure that we have that movement prep. Early back, it's interesting to look at movement prep now versus when I was way back in the cavewoman days of school.
In the snow.
And We talked about movement prep as far as warm up. We call it warm up, and we called it, there was stretching in there, but it was also to raise the body temperature, to allow the fluids within the tissues to be able to become more viscous and glide over each other, particularly if you're in a colder environment. Down here in the warm weather and the humid weather, it's a little bit easier to get that way. But in either case, you have to have the tissues be able to glide over each other. Otherwise, we're looking at one, limited motion, two, increased risk of strain. And then we see just limited, abbreviated motions until they warm up. I mean, how often have we said, well, we're a bit tight, but as we start moving, we start loosening up a little bit. When I look at movement prep today, I've referred to the big movement rocks before. You said you started at the ground. I'm going to assume an upright posture. So what's the conduit, the interface between the body and the ground? It's the foot and ankle. All right, you've got 33 joints, 24 muscles, 26 bones in the foot, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on down there. And that has to create certain actions. Yesterday, we did an evaluation on a VIP client that came in, and that person had significant foot and ankle dysfunction, which the foot and ankle has to turn on the glute to be able to have successful triplane movements. All muscles, all joints work in 3 planes of motion, and the majority of books aren't going to talk about that at all, but in fact they do. So the foot has to do certain things to make the phone call to the glute, and the hips to allow the hips to move in all 3 planes of motion. And the movement prep that you do that. I've seen it. It's forward and back movements, it's side to side movements, it's rotational movements. When you think about it, the majority of programs that people see out on the internet, what they read in books, or they often see on television or on their devices, is forward and back, what we call the sagittal plane, flexion and extension. And in fact, our most powerful plane of motion is rotation. Interestingly, the most common plane of motion where we see injuries, transverse plane in rotation. So we have to make sure that that rotation is coming from the foot and ankle, the hips, and then we look at the thoracic spine. The most common injuries we see, what's number 1?
Low back.
Low back pain. Number 2 is knee. Number 3 is shoulder, then cervical spine. Well, if you think about it, the knee is stuck between the foot and the hip, and it's going to do what foot and hip tells it to do. The low back is stuck between the hips and the thoracic spine. If in my experiences with the many, well over 100 patients that you've sent me, I don't know if it's a chicken or egg, because typically when they come from you, they're already injured, but there's a limitation in one or all 3 of those big movement rocks regions. So we have to look at forward, side to side, and rotation, and to get all those tissues and joints working in 3 planes of motion.
Let me give you some color on that question. So those are the ones that you've had experience with, and it's more than that. They're all caused by other problems in other parts of their bodies, unless it's traumatic, and it's a specific trauma involving the spine. And you know, the gentleman we did yesterday with the evaluation and planning, what an incredible example of this discussion that was. You know, here's someone referred to me for severe lumbosacral degenerative spine condition, you know, including some weakness in the left quad, some weakness in foot and ankle, an MRI that matched everything, 0 symptom complex that made you think it was neurologic, and yet all the building blocks from a surgeon's perspective to operate. Multiple surgical opinions for surgery. Well, it didn't sound right to me, and we brought him down to Orlando from Georgia and did a thorough biomechanical and performance evaluation on him. And what was most striking was how severe his foot and ankle dysfunction was, and how that created the chain that escalated all the way up the left side of his body, all the way up to the left spine. And from that perspective, it made sense. And as it turned out, you know, the opportunity wasn't to do surgery on his low back. The opportunity was really to understand the value of that severe broken, sprained left ankle when he was an adolescent, and the ripple effect it had on every other joint up the chain. And this is still an avid 58-year-old active athlete with 2 well-developed sons playing D1 football and baseball, high-level human, extremely high performance. And here we are 40 years later with the consequences of all that. So with that as the canvas, you know, I've learned so much interacting with you guys, and yesterday was the most perfect example of that I think I've seen in my career.
Yeah.
And you know, thankfully, I saw past the surgical solution and brought them to you guys.
And that's what makes you, such a trailblazer in this industry, an industry that you're in, is because you say, I'm a surgeon, but surgeon is not my first option. I'm trying to avoid surgery if possible. There are times that surgery is going to be required, but if we can avoid that, we'll do that. And so when Chuck was speaking earlier, talking about the challenges that he has in the low back, right? The challenges having low back, that's a stable joint. So with this alternating joint pattern that we have, right, where we have ankle, the foot is stable, ankle is mobile, knee is stable, hip is mobile, lumbar spine is stable, thoracic spine is mobile, cervical spine is stable, and this alternating joint pattern throughout our body. If we understand what should be stable and what should be mobile, all right, it makes it a lot easier for us to understand how to train it. And I see some gut-wrenching exercises sometimes that I see and I go, oh no, please don't do this. For example, if someone has, if they're laying on their back and they have their legs in the air and they're doing this windshield wiper or whatever, it's like we're stabilizing thoracic spine, right? And we're trying to mobilize lumbar spine, and that's completely the opposite of how our body's designed. So being able to understand what's mobile and what's stable can help us avoid a lot of those challenges.
Well,
and challenges mean injuries.
Yes. Try to be nice about it.
Yeah, exactly.
In all due respect to you and other top professionals in the industry, I want to modify that mobile, stable, mobile theory.
Okay.
Because the foot, to some degree, needs to be mobile. But at the same time, the subtalar joint and the midfoot need to be, I'm sorry, you said stable. The midfoot and the subtalar joint of the foot, which allows for pronation, needs to be mobile. Yeah. But we need to have some degree of stability. Yeah. The ankle needs to be stable in more in the frontal plane or side-to-side motion, but it better be mobile in forward and back motion. The knee, they whoever they are, and what the books are saying, the knee should flex and extend, but there is a good degree of rotation and frontal plane motion because the knee is what I call the dumbest joint in the body, and it depends on what the foot and the hip tell it to do. So all tissues, all joints are designed to have some degree of triplane mobility, and if we had a fourth dimension of a bit of glide or translation. Now, with that being said, though, certain joints are predominant in a plane of motion, where they should be more mobile in a plane of motion and more stable in another. Where we run into the issue, and as the point you brought up, is aside from blunt trauma, typically in overuse injuries, the site of the injury is not the problem. It's a limitation at a joint level above or below, maybe 2 levels above or below, that become limited in motion, and the compensation occurs. This gentleman yesterday, it was a prime example, as you perfectly articulated, is there was a significant foot and ankle dysfunction. He had a tremendous amount of instability of getting the big toe joint down on the ground, which is setting the entire system up for failure. He also didn't have good pronation, supination, which again doesn't allow the system to load properly. And as I referred to it, the phone call had a lot of static from the foot to the hip. What was interesting, we started him with some isometric work first, because he had some discomfort in the hip more so. Yes, the MRIs, as you showed us, and what was interesting, how it was all left-sided, and it was a left-sided hip issue. We often see opposite issues going on over an opposite injury, but in this case, everything with his compensation was to his left lateral. But we started with some isometric work just to awaken, just to sensitize and get that neurological pathway working. But at the same time, when you do isometric work, it is not going to be inflammatory because there's no concentric motion going on.
Right.
And then you started him with some concentric work where the muscle was shortening as you articulated and explained to him yesterday, the leg was moving, so that's open chain. But at some point, we need to then take that isolated action and put it into the chain as an integrated movement. And we got him up moving, just some slow regressive movements side to side to allow the foot to move. That is now he was saying, oh, I feel this in my hip. And all of a sudden his movements were starting to clear out.
Yeah, so let me clarify that to the audience. I mean, so when he said he was having difficulty walking as a consequence to his spine problem, his lumbar spine problem that warranted potential surgery, he wasn't saying that the walking pattern couldn't be adapted, evolved, or fixed in a way that would put less stress on his low back and cause less. That's the key. It takes a more intelligent analysis than just looking at an MRI and assuming that you have a spinal condition to jump to spine surgery. It could be foot and ankle dysfunction. Every athlete who's ever had a sprained ankle, pay attention to your foot and ankle. Proprioception is your knowledge of where you are in space. If you've lost your proprioception, or if you've lost your ability to be flexible and strong through your ankle joint in multiple planes, that sets you up for gait patterns that adversely affect your low back. Even if you fix the low back, which is a misnomer, you modify it, you structurally modify it forever, you haven't fixed the root cause, which is the walking pattern in those cases. So it really takes a three-dimensional analysis of cause and effect.
What's interesting about the walking pattern, the lumbar spine will go through a small degree of rotation. A small degree. From L1 to L5, it graduates a little bit closer to the pelvis, which has a lot of rotation. So as you get from L1 down to lumbar 5, 6, where there's a little bit more. But what we'll see is you could have immobility in your great toe. You can have immobility in the ankle. You can have immobility in the hip. All those patterns are going to cause the same reaction at the low back. You could have a shoulder injury and be immobilized in a sling, so you lose rotation. The foot function through the hip function is going to cause you to lose rotation. You're going to lose the length of your stride. You're going to lose side-to-side motion. But the forces from the ground all the way up and from the top down, guess where they have to pass through?
So
the low back, and that's going to make up the difference. That's going to compensate for it.
All of that is 100% correct. With due respect, you're speaking amongst us right now from more of a clinical perspective, right? The general public that is going to be listening to this information understands probably 20% of that, right? So when we start talking about stable, alternating joint patterns of stable and mobile, it's not incorrect. Of course, there's some articulation through the knee. There's some articulation through the stable joints. Absolutely, right? So now we're getting to more of the details. But when it comes down to understanding, as you say, the big rocks of movement, the foot and ankle, right, the hips and thoracic spine, there's also big rocks of general understanding about movement, right, which is what is mobile and what is stable. Yep. And if we can identify those things for the general public, then we start talking about the game of golf, something which I have a huge affinity for. I have an opportunity to work with some of the best players in the world through the last several years. We see something very unique, and I've said this on the Golf Channel, I've said this in magazines and whatnot. One of the worst things, in my opinion, that a golf instructor can say to an athlete is, get in an athletic stance, okay? Because if I ask Chuck, a baseball player, to get in an athletic stance, he's going to show me a quad dominant, extended thoracic spine, extended cervical, prepared, balls of the feet, ready to pounce type scenario. Same with coach. If I say he's probably going to get in some defensive basketball stance or something, because when you ask athletes to get in an athletic stance, that's what they're going to do, right? But the reality of golf is it's such a weird, dynamic, and violent move for the spine, right? That you must get into a position of a pelvis that is more neutral, where the lumbar spine and thoracic spine are actually neutral to one another versus extended to create stability, because we're trying to create that movement, that range of motion, that mobility. And oftentimes the reason why people end up having to see you is because somebody told them to get in an athletic stance and they swing swing after swing after swing, stabilizing the spine but asking it to rotate. So if we can understand that from the general public perspective, even recreational golfers can have a better chance of keeping their spine safe and also improve performance. The next thing about that is that my job as a golf performance coach is to deliver to the golf instructor an athlete that can make all the necessary adjustments, do all the movements that they know need to be done to improve their game. And the game of golf is a hard game, and it's a hard game to be good at, and it's an even harder game to be good at all the time, okay? So like a guy like me, I can hit every shot on the golf course. I just can't do them all in the same hole and all in the same round of golf, right? So you're talking about different levels of excellence. And what we're really trying to do is, number one, we want to keep people safe and healthy so they can enjoy the game a whole lot more. And then from there, we want to see if we can help them improve their scores. For me, I start with just movement, activation that we discussed earlier, stability, then mobility, and then coordination. Because oftentimes people's lack of coordination or lack of understanding of kinematic sequencing and how to generate power from the ground up, it doesn't have to be a high-level conversation, but sometimes I take it to something that's super ridiculous and low level. You ready for this? Have you ever skipped rocks before on the lake behind your house?
Sure.
You ever taken a shell and skipped it at the ocean to see if you can make it jump over the wave? Well, I like to tell people I'm the champion rock skipper, right? And what does that look like, right? You step, the hip comes out, then the torso, then the arm, there's lag with the wrist, and ultimately that hand comes through to skip that rock, right? If you don't do that correctly, the immediate feedback is boop, like the rock is right there. You can pick it back up again. So it's very simple concepts that are going to help people understand.
What order were you doing that?
From the ground up, kinematic sequencing, front
Get
side,
the
hips, torso,
Torso.
arm, hand.
If you can keep the hips and the torso, just in any sport, but especially golf, have the motion come primarily from there, you're going to see greater performance.
No doubt.
You'll protect
The best
the
bang
back.
for the buck.
Yes.
You
Best
know,
bang for the
it's
buck.
funny, people come, golfers. My busiest practice in Orlando is golfers with low back problems. And again, the big assumption being it's a low back fundamental problem, but none of them have really optimized hip and pelvis, range of motion, flexibility by the time they come. So, you sometimes have to go backwards before you can go forwards. Sure. And I'm always having to figure out root cause. Am I really here to treat the spinal condition, or can I optimize the physical condition and avoid spinal surgery? And no matter what, even if I do spinal surgery, I want to make sure that all of those building blocks, all of those foundational things are optimized. Otherwise, they're going to be back with the same problem, that spot or a different spot, shortly after surgery anyway.
Exactly right.
And it's not always the surgery's fault.
Right.
It may be the ignorance around the surgery's fault. And so there is another layer to the way we all need to think about this physical performance, injury management, injury recovery. And so just make sure that in your own universe, because again, you'll get an opinion no matter what, but you won't always get the best information.
That's true.
And to some extent, you have to be your own advocate, and you have to at least ask these questions and make sure that the information you get back in the face of an injury or injury recovery strategy makes sense, to you. And if it doesn't, keep searching. Don't just dive into a quick fix American style surgery, because it doesn't exist. It's a process. And that's a small piece of the process.
What's interesting is we talked about, and we've thrown out the terms today and in other podcasts, is mobility and flexibility.
Right.
They're interrelated. Your movement prep is going to promote both, but we have to understand that flexibility typically is around a joint. It's the range of motion of a joint, but the summation of joints is going to lead to the mobility. That's where movement prep comes in. You talked about synchronicity of movement. That's where the mobility will come into play. When you have the mobility, what happens to strength? What happens to power? It goes upward tremendously, exponentially.
That efficiency, yeah. So, and then if we can identify that there are some areas that flexibility is a little bit more important, and some areas that we really need to focus on the range of motion in a joint. If people can understand how to get to that through an active dynamic warm-up, through a movement preparation routine, which is what the comeback team provides, right? We've been coming out with our new series of flexibility exercises and routines to help people understand how to have positive, active range of motion, not just passive range of motion, so that it can be innervated, so that it's something that can be, in a position where we can actually use it, right? We can create a contraction and we can generate power.
The key word of the day is purposeful.
Being purposeful, right? Purposeful, specific intention, right? And we must train with specific intention if we want to be able to achieve something specific when we get on the golf course or any other activity for that matter.
So, Comeback Team community, this is the foundational aspect by which we really encourage an active plan for physical well-being and how you build that body up into the performance vessel that it's really intended to be in a safe, healthy, and globally conscious way, because ultimately it is about who you want to be when you grow up, regardless of how old you are. So anyway, thank you for joining us from our Orlando studio. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, LinkedIn, and our website, comeback.team. Thanks again. Have a great day.